The display on the dashboard read 11:42 p.m. when the phone buzzed against the passenger seat. It wasn't a call. It was a single text message from a burner number that had remained dormant for exactly 4 years. 2 words. Stark against the white glow of the screen. Blue Lantern. Victoria Vance did not hit the brakes. She didn't gasp. 30 years in marine intelligence taught you that adrenaline was a resource to be spent wisely, not wasted on panic. She simply pressed her foot harder against the accelerator of her old Volvo. The tires cutting through the sheets of rain blinding Route 1. Exactly 22 minutes later, the car screeched to a halt on the pristine cobblestone driveway of a multi-million-dollar colonial estate in the affluent suburb of Concord, Massachusetts. The house was dark, save for a single flickering light on the second floor. Victoria didn't knock. She slipped her spare key into the heavy mahogany door, her hand steady, her eyes tracking the environment with predatory precision. The moment the deadbolt clicked open, the heavy, suffocating silence of the house was shattered. From the top of the stairs came a sound that made Victoria's blood run cold, the muffled, breathless sobbing of her 6-year-old granddaughter, Maya. And then, a man's voice booming, venomous, trembling with an erratic, dangerous rage. It was Christopher. He was shouting, his words slurred, but sharp enough to cut. Victoria stood in the dim foyer, her coat dripping rainwater onto the polished oak floor, looking back at that exact moment. The horror didn't stem from the violent echoes reverberating through the hallways of that pristine home. What terrified me most wasn't the screaming behind closed doors. It was the chilling realization that I had spent years ignoring the quiet, subtle signs right in front of my eyes. To understand how Victoria Vance found herself standing in that dark foyer, one had to understand who she was. For 3 decades, Colonel Victoria Vance had been the person the government sent into smoke-filled rooms to dissect lies. She could read a man's pulse by watching the vein in his throat. She had survived deployments in Fallujah and psychological warfare in Berlin. Now, retired, she lived a quiet, solitary life in a secluded cottage in Kennebunkport. She grew her own vegetables, read historical biographies, and pretended the ghosts of her past didn't follow her into the garden. Her entire world revolved around 2 people, her daughter, Lillian, and her granddaughter, Maya. Lillian was a creature of light. Before she met Christopher, she was an artist whose canvases were explosions of vibrant, unapologetic color. She was gentle, empathetic to a fault, and possessed a rare kind of kindness that Victoria had always sought to protect. But over the last 5 years, that light had been systematically dimmed. Lillian had become quiet. Her laughter, once loud and infectious, had evolved into a soft, nervous chuckle. She apologized constantly for the weather, for being late, for breathing too loudly in a room. She was shrinking, vanishing into the background of her own life. Then there was Christopher Davis. When Christopher first arrived in Lillian's life, he seemed like a miracle straight out of a New England high society catalog. A highly successful corporate attorney at a prestigious Boston firm, Christopher was charismatic, flawlessly groomed, and devastatingly polite. He bought Lillian flowers for no reason, opened doors, and charmed Victoria with his knowledge of military history. He was the perfect American husband, but Victoria's instincts, honed by decades of counterintelligence, had always detected a microscopic tremor beneath Christopher's polished veneer. His generosity wasn't kindness, it was a transaction. Every compliment he gave Lillian was wrapped in a subtle, invisible thread of control. He didn't build her up, he placed her in a gilded cage, making sure she knew he was the one holding the key. The warning signs hadn't appeared like a sudden thunderstorm. They had eroded the foundation of Lillian's life like drops of water on limestone. Victoria remembered them all now. A series of disjointed memories that finally locked into a terrifying mosaic. There was the Thanksgiving dinner, 3 years ago. Lillian had spent 48 hours preparing a traditional roast, her hands trembling with a desire to please Christopher's high society colleagues. At the table, when a senior partner complimented the dish, Christopher smiled warmly, patted Lillian's hand, and said, "She tried so hard. Bless her. The enthusiasm makes up for the overcooked meat, doesn't it?" The table laughed. Lillian had forced a smile, her eyes fixed entirely on her plate. She didn't look up for the rest of the night. Then came the sudden cancellations. Victoria would drive down from Maine for a scheduled weekend dinner, only to receive a text from Lillian 20 minutes before arrival. "So sorry, Mom. Christopher had a brutal day at the firm, and he really needs a quiet night with just the family. Let's reschedule." Worse than the cancellations was the behavior of little Maya. The child, usually vibrant and talkative, became strangely hypervigilant whenever her father entered a room. Victoria once watched Maya accidentally spill a glass of apple juice on the kitchen island. The 6-year-old didn't cry, she froze, her eyes widening in sheer terror, glancing instinctively toward the hallway where Christopher was working. Lillian had rushed over, desperately wiping the juice away, whispering, "It's okay, sweetie. It's okay." Daddy didn't see. Christopher's control extended to Lillian's speech. In public, whenever Lillian began to express an opinion on politics, art, or even her own paintings, Christopher would smoothly interrupt. "What Lily means to say is," he would begin, completely rewriting her thoughts with a patronizing smile. He treated her like an erratic child who needed constant supervision, and Lillian stopped looking people in the eye. Whenever Victoria tried to probe, to ask how things really were behind the closed doors of their Concord estate, Lillian would pull away, wrapping her arms around herself. "Christopher is just stressed. Mom, he does so much for us. I just need to be better." Every micro flicker of hesitation, every downward glance, every hushed apology was a breadcrumb leading to a cliff. Victoria had seen them, but she had let herself believe the lie because her daughter begged her to. The phrase "Blue Lantern" wasn't a random choice. It was a tactical contingency Victoria had established with Lillian years ago, disguised as a playful what-if game over a bottle of wine. If you are ever in a situation where you cannot speak, where you are trapped and need an extraction, Victoria had told her daughter, her voice deadly serious, "You send me those 2 words. No context, no explanation. I will come for you." And now, the lantern was lit. As Victoria moved silently up the carpeted stairs of the Concord home, her mind shifted into operational focus. The storm outside battered the windows, the wind howling like a wounded animal. She reached the landing, her boots making no sound. She called Raymond on her earpiece, a retired tactical operative she had known since her days in the Pentagon. The only man she trusted with secrets that didn't exist on paper. "Raymond, I'm inside the objective. Stand by for coordination." "Copy that, Colonel." Raymond's gravelly voice crackled through the earpiece. "Local authorities are 40 minutes out due to the storm washout on Route 2. You're on your own for now." Victoria pushed open the double doors of the master bedroom. The scene inside was a jagged fragment of a nightmare. The room was bathed in the harsh light of an overturned bedside lamp. On the floor lay a shattered bottle of expensive Cabernet, its deep red liquid pooling across the cream-colored Persian rug like a massive, expanding stain of blood. Lillian was on her knees in the corner of the room, her hair disheveled, her face pale. She was holding Maya tightly against her chest, shielding the trembling child with her own body. Lillian's lower lip was split, a thin line of crimson trickling down her chin. Standing over them was Christopher. He still wore his tailored suit trousers and a crisp white shirt, but the top buttons were torn open. In his right hand, but he held a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch. His eyes were bloodshot. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in his face jumped. He looked wild, a dangerous animal trapped in his own delusion. Completely detached from the charming lawyer he presented to the world, when Christopher heard the rustle of Victoria's wet trench coat, he didn't run. He didn't raise his fists. Instead, he took a slow sip of his scotch, straightened his posture, and let out a soft, condescending chuckle. The mask, though cracked, was immediately pulled back into place. "Victoria," Christopher said, his voice instantly dropping into that smooth, courtroom cadence that had fooled judges for a decade. "You really should learn to call before driving all the way from Maine. You're letting your old military paranoia get the best of you. We had a small domestic misunderstanding. Lily had a clumsy spill on the stairs. I was just helping her up." Victoria didn't answer right away. She stood in the doorway, her hands loose at her sides, her eyes sweeping the room. She noted the shattered lamp. The trajectory suggested it had been thrown at Lillian. She noted the defensive bruising starting to form on Lillian's forearms. She noted the way Christopher stood, blocking the path to the door, anchoring his weight on his back leg. He was assessing Victoria as a threat, evaluating his options. "Get up, Lillian," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, vibrational command that commanded absolute obedience. Lillian whimpered, her eyes darting to Christopher in pure, unadulterated terror. She didn't move. The psychological conditioning ran too deep. She was paralyzed by the fear of what he would do once Victoria left. "She's not going anywhere, Victoria," Christopher said, stepping closer, his polite demeanor curdling into cold malice. "This is my house. This is my wife. You are an intruder here. If you don't turn around and walk out that door, I will have the Concord police arrest you before the rain stops. I know the police chief personally. Who do you think they're going to believe? A retired, unhinged old soldier, or me?" Victoria took one step forward. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. "Christopher," she said softly. Her eyes locked onto his. "I spent 30 years breaking men far more intelligent and dangerous than you in dark rooms you don't have the security clearance to know exist. You are a small, fragile boy hiding behind a law degree. Look at me very closely. Do you think I give a single damn about your police chief?" For a split second, Christopher's eyes flickered with genuine fear. He looked at Victoria's stance, realizing that despite her age, she was a weapon designed to destroy. Within 20 minutes, Raymond arrived in an unmarked SUV, providing the tactical shield Victoria needed to extract Lillian and Maya from the house without a physical altercation. They retreated to a secure, private apartment in Boston's Back Bay. A safe house Victoria maintained under an assumed corporate name. It was only there, beneath the warm light of a kitchen island with a cup of hot tea between her trembling hands, that Lillian finally began to break. The dam collapsed, and the horrific reality of her marriage poured out in a breathless, weeping confession. "It wasn't just tonight, Mom," Lillian whispered, her voice cracking as she stared into her mug. "It's been everything. For the last 3 years, he hasn't let me breathe." She explained the meticulous nature of Christopher's tyranny. He had installed tracking spyware on her phone under the guise of family safety. He had systematically cut her off from her old art school friends, inventing lies about them until Lillian felt too isolated to reach out. He controlled the bank accounts, giving her a strict weekly allowance that required her to submit digital receipts for every single purchase, down to a pack of gum or a gallon of milk. If a receipt was missing, he would punish her with days of absolute, freezing silence, treating her like a non-entity in her own home until she begged for his forgiveness. But the final, crushing blow, the catalyst that had driven Lillian to finally send the Blue Lantern signal, was a discovery she had made only hours before the violence erupted. I went into his home office to find a tax document. Lillian sobbed, her tears falling into her tea. And I found the statement for Maya's trust fund. The money my grandparents left her for college. The $300,000. Mom. It's gone. Christopher emptied the entire account 3 weeks ago. He transferred it to an offshore entity, listed in the Cayman Islands. Victoria felt a cold, hard knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't just a man losing his temper. This was a calculated, systemic liquidation. Christopher wasn't just abusing his family, he was preparing to strip them of everything and discard them. The next morning, the counteroffensive began. Victoria didn't rely on standard legal channels. She knew Christopher's influence within the Massachusetts judicial system was extensive. Instead, she mobilized Raymond to conduct a full-scale forensic audit of Christopher's life. For 48 hours, Raymond's team operated out of the Back Bay safe house, transforming the dining table into a tactical intelligence hub. They intercepted digital footprints, scraped server data from Christopher's law firm, and monitored his communications. What they discovered was a massive, crumbling house of cards. Christopher wasn't just a successful lawyer, he was a desperate gambler who had dug himself into a catastrophic financial grave. He had been secretly funneling millions of dollars from his firm's elite client escrow accounts to cover massive personal losses in unregulated offshore cryptocurrency markets. He was embezzling on a grand scale, using his flawless reputation as a shield. But the investigation yielded an even more explosive piece of leverage. "Look at this, Colonel," Raymond said, sliding a manila folder across the table to Victoria. "Christopher has been having an affair for the past 14 months with a woman named Caroline Vance, no relation to you, the wife of Arthur Vance." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she scanned the surveillance photographs. Arthur Vance was one of the most powerful, ruthless real estate billionaires in Boston. And more importantly, he was the primary corporate client keeping Christopher's law firm solvent. Christopher wasn't just sleeping with his client's wife. He was using Arthur's corporate accounts to fund Caroline's lavish lifestyle, hiding the expenses under fraudulent legal billing codes. "He's preparing to flee the country," Victoria observed, looking at the offshore transfer dates. The liquidation of Maya's trust fund was his escape money. He's planning to leverage a high-profile divorce, pin the financial discrepancies on a junior partner, and vanish with Caroline. "He's smart." Raymond nodded. "He's got every loophole covered." Victoria stood up, walking to the window overlooking the gray Boston skyline. "A man who thinks he's covered every loophole is a man who is blind to the cliff right in front of him. We aren't going to sue him, Raymond. We are going to dismantle him." Victoria brought in Valerie, a legendary, razor-sharp forensic divorce attorney known in Boston legal circles as the Executioner. Valerie didn't file standard motions, she weaponized information with surgical precision. Instead of taking the evidence of Christopher's financial fraud to the district attorney, where Christopher's connections could delay the indictment for months, Victoria chose a more devastating, immediate route. She had Valerie draft a comprehensive, ironclad legal dossier detailing the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, and the exact digital logs of the affair between Christopher and Caroline. Then, they delivered the dossier directly to Arthur Vance. The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. Arthur Vance did not call the police. He used his immense corporate power to immediately freeze every single asset associated with Christopher's law firm. He initiated an internal, private audit of the firm's accounts, locking Christopher out of the building by noon that Tuesday. Simultaneously, Valerie leaked the encrypted financial logs of the offshore Cayman accounts to the Compliance Committee of the Massachusetts Bar Association. Within 12 hours, Christopher's carefully constructed world began to violently fracture from the outer edges. His corporate credit cards were declined. His firm issued a hushed, emergency press release stating that Mr. Davis was on an unspecified medical leave effective immediately. Christopher was losing control of his narrative. And for a narcissist, the loss of narrative is equivalent to a lack of oxygen. He became desperate. He left 32 frantic, threatening voicemails on Lillian's deactivated phone, his voice escalating from weeping pleas for reconciliation to manic, unhinged threats of total destruction. He was unraveling, precisely according to Victoria's operational design. The climax did not take place in a sterile courtroom, but beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Symphony Hall in Boston, during the annual Symphony Orchestra Benefactors Gala, an event where Christopher had spent years cultivating his high society image. Christopher, desperate to project an illusion of normalcy and stability to his remaining allies, had used his final remaining personal funds to secure a VIP table. He believed that if he appeared in public, confident and smiling, he could stymie the rumors destroying his reputation. The grand ballroom was a sea of black tuxedos, silk gowns, and clinking champagne flutes. Christopher stood near the grand ice sculpture, a glass of champagne in his hand, his smile tight, his eyes darting anxiously around the room. The double doors of the ballroom opened, and the air in the room shifted. Victoria Vance walked in, her posture regal, wearing a tailored midnight blue evening suit that looked like a modern suit of armor. Beside her was Valerie, holding a slim leather briefcase, but it was the person walking between them that made Christopher's champagne glass tremble. It was Lillian. She wore a stunning, emerald green gown. Her hair was swept up, exposing her face entirely. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't looking at the floor. Her chin was up, her eyes clear, sharp, and focused entirely on her husband. Before Christopher could react, a heavy hand descended onto his shoulder from behind. He turned to face Arthur Vance. Arthur's face was a mask of cold, billionaire rage. Standing next to Arthur was his wife, Caroline, her face streaked with mascara, looking pale and terrified. Behind them stood 2 plainclothes financial investigators from the state attorney's office. Arthur, Christopher stammered, his charm completely deserting him, his voice cracking. Arthur, let me explain. The documentation you received, it's a fabricated hit piece by my mother-in-law. It's an extortion plot. The surrounding high society guests began to quiet down, turning their heads toward the brewing scandal. The pristine, polite veneer of the gala was cracking wide open. Victoria stepped into the circle, her voice calm, carrying across the immediate radius with absolute authority. The forensic logs don't lie. Christopher, the $300,000 you stole from your daughter's future is currently sitting in a frozen account in Grand Cayman, recovered by the state of Massachusetts 3 hours ago. Christopher looked around the circle, his eyes wild, realizing he was completely surrounded. The judges he knew were turning their backs. The partners at his firm were walking away into the crowd. He looked at Lillian, his expression shifting into a desperate, feral glare. "Lily," Christopher hissed, taking a step toward her, his mask completely dropping, exposing the monster beneath. Tell them you're a hysterical liar. You think you can survive without me? You are nothing without my money, without my name. You will crawl back to me on your knees." The room went completely silent. Everyone waited for Lillian to shrink, to apologize, to break under the familiar weight of his terror. Lillian took a step forward, closing the distance between them until she was standing mere inches from the man who had imprisoned her mind for half a decade. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. "Christopher," Lillian said, her voice resonant, steady, and entirely devoid of fear. "I spent 5 years staying quiet because I thought I was protecting our family. But tonight, look around this room. Everyone sees you for exactly what you are. I will never protect your secrets again. You are entirely on your own." It was the most expensive, devastating sentence ever uttered in that ballroom. Christopher's face contorted into an ugly, powerless mask of rage as the two state investigators stepped forward, quietly clipping handcuffs around his wrists before leading him out through the side doors of the hall, away from the glittering society he had traded his soul to impress. The aftermath did not involve a grand celebration, because true healing is a quiet, slow process that occurs in the spaces between milestones. 6 months later, the colonial estate in Concord was sold. Its profits split and used to fully restore Maya's trust fund under a strict, independent legal guardianship managed by Victoria and Valerie. Christopher's trial for corporate embezzlement and financial fraud was scheduled for the upcoming winter, and his disbarment had been executed with swift, unappealable finality in a bright, sun-drenched loft apartment in Boston's South End. The sound of laughter had finally returned. Lillian had taken a position as a creative director for a nonprofit arts program helping survivors of domestic trauma reclaim their voices through painting. The canvases in her studio were no longer muted watercolors, they were giant, sweeping landscapes of brilliant crimson, deep blues, and blazing gold. Victoria sat on the small balcony of the apartment, watching little Maya play on the living room rug. Maya was coloring, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. When she dropped a green crayon and it rolled under the sofa, she didn't freeze. She simply giggled, scrambled onto her hands and knees, retrieved it, and kept drawing. Lillian walked out onto the balcony, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She leaned against the railing, the autumn wind catching her hair. Her face looked lighter, the lines of chronic exhaustion and fear completely wiped clean from her skin. The phone on the outdoor table buzzed. It was an automated notification from the state correctional facility, a routine monthly log indicating that Christopher had attempted to place a restricted inmate call to Lillian's number. The system had automatically blocked it, per the permanent restraining order. Lillian didn't even pick up the phone. She simply looked at the screen, smiled softly, and took a sip of her coffee. Victoria watched her daughter, a deep, profound sense of peace settling into her chest. She had spent her entire military career believing that victory was defined by the complete, violent destruction of an enemy. But sitting here on this balcony, watching the light dance across Lillian's face, she finally understood the truth. Some victories aren't about defeating someone else. They are about the moment you realize you are no longer afraid of them. Inside the apartment, on a high shelf near the doorway, sat an old, decorative marine lantern painted in a deep, weathered shade of navy. Its glass was clean, its metal polished, but its bulb was dark. The blue lantern had served its purpose. The signal was no longer needed. Because the storm had passed, and the house was finally safe.